In 1941, in the darkest moment of the Second World War, two scientists met under the noses of the Gestapo. They were the world's top nuclear physicists. Werner Heisenberg was German. Niels Bohr was a Danish Jew. For 20 years, they'd been best friends. Their insights into the atom had unwittingly paved the way to the most dramatic scientific landmark of the 20th century, the first atomic bomb. Their wartime meeting turned on the frightening prospect that the first man to use the bomb would be Hitler. What happened at that Copenhagen meeting cast a shadow over the rest of their lives and made their relationship one of the most controversial in the history of science. But this year, long after both men's deaths, their story has taken on a strange new twist. In 1922, at a university in Germany, something was about to happen which would change the lives of two men. Many of the world's most eminent scientists were gathering for a lecture. The star attraction was the brilliant Danish physicist Niels Bohr. At the age of 36, he'd just won the Nobel Prize for his groundbreaking insights into the inner workings of the atom. Niels Bohr prepared to face his audience with some apprehension. His new ideas would face the scrutiny of rigorous mathematicians, famous for their skepticism of anything that couldn't be proved with an equation.
Bohr certainly was trying out his ideas on one of the most critical and interesting audiences. If that audience really was convinced by what he had to say about his atomic model, then everyone would have to be convinced.
It was perhaps the major event in his scientific life so far in terms of presenting his ideas.
What happened next would set off an unstoppable chain reaction. The audience were hanging on every word of Bohr's lecture, not least because of his idiosyncratic way of talking. He spoke quietly, often mumbling, with the additional difficulty of speaking German with a heavy Danish accent.
Bohr talking slowly, very silently, with his hand in the front of his mouth. People have a hard time understanding, and one of Heisenberg's contemporaries, Hund, told me how he sat there in one of the last rows with his ear bending forward, trying to understand what this man is mumbling, changing languages while he is speaking from Danish to German to English and backwards. It must have been very confusing.
In the middle of the lecture, the eminent professor was interrupted. From the back row of the lecture hall, a young man dared to put up his hand to challenge Niels Bohr. The rest of the delegates looked round in shock.
A young man jumped up saying, "There is a mathematical mistake in what you were saying." And you know, that was not quite something people were used to, particularly in Germany, I think.
Niels Bohr was instantly impressed. The young man's challenge was a good one, and Bohr was so intrigued by his level of understanding that he asked him to go for a walk in the hills that afternoon, so they could continue their discussion. As they walked, Bohr learned about the man who was to become the most important collaborator of his life. Werner Heisenberg was a 20-year-old student at Munich University with a gift for mathematics. He'd been reading up about the developing field of atomic physics, including the ideas of Niels Bohr. He was a keen musician and, like Bohr, a lover of philosophy. They began to realize how much they had in common. Heisenberg dedicated most of his spare time to his love of nature. It was a passion shared by Niels Bohr. Both men drew from nature their fascination for understanding the scientific laws of the physical world.
Mathematics is the language of nature, and that's where Niels Bohr and Heisenberg worked so well. Niels Bohr had the picture. He had the physical insight. He could see these electrons dancing inside the atom. Heisenberg was mathematically gifted. So it was a match made in heaven.
That afternoon, one of the great scientific collaborations was born. Together they would lead atomic science into a new era. Niels Bohr had made his name by creating the most famous picture of the atom, which challenged traditional physics. He depicted the atom as being separated into distinct parts, operating like a minute solar system, with particles called electrons orbiting a central nucleus. It was revolutionary because for centuries, physics had taught that the atom could never be broken down into separate parts.
Because after all, what does atom mean? Tom means cut. A means cannot. Atom means cannot cut. And so ever since the Greeks, we were brainwashed into thinking that atom means an object that cannot be cut.
Niels Bohr's work was so revolutionary that in the 1920s, scientists from all over the world came to Copenhagen to learn about the new field of atomic physics from the famous Professor Bohr. To introduce some of his visitors to the subject, he took them on an outing, not to a laboratory, but to Copenhagen's most famous church. He led them up the elaborate golden staircase, into the bell tower, and finally to the mechanism of the church clock. For hundreds of years, students of physics had been taught that everything in nature obeyed the basic laws of cause and effect, and was as predictable as clockwork. But Professor Bohr wanted his visitors to understand that the atom didn't seem to conform to these basic laws of physics.
The point was that you can see every movement and you could predict every movement, so that it was cause and effect, it was one wheel moving into another. That was definitely not the case of the atom.
Bohr had begun to realize that there was a puzzle in the world of the atom. It was in the strange behavior of the tiny electron particles. They didn't follow a constant orbit like the planets round the sun. They made sudden, unpredictable jumps from one orbit to another. Bohr believed the potential energy inside the atom couldn't be unlocked without knowing why the particles were jumping.
Why should the Earth jump to the orbit of Mars? Why should Jupiter jump back to the orbit of the Earth? We don't see that in the solar system, so why should we see that in the atom? So Bohr had a problem. He was now pushing the limits of Newtonian physics. The atom was not really a solar system. But what was it?
Niels Bohr had to understand the strange dance of the electron particles. Finding the answer was the key to unlocking the secrets of the atom. He needed inspiration. In 1925, Werner Heisenberg arrived. He'd come to Copenhagen to take up the position as Niels Bohr's assistant. Before long, Heisenberg also became Niels Bohr's best friend. The atom itself was too small to see, but in a cloud chamber, clues about the dancing electrons could be gleaned because they left a vapor trail. Heisenberg and Bohr knew the electrons were making quantum leaps to jump from one orbit to another, and emitting energy as they did. Within a year, the young Heisenberg produced the first set of rules for understanding them. He discovered a complex way of using mathematics to keep track of where the electrons were in relation to each other and the nucleus. The work represented the birth of a new field of physics. It was christened quantum mechanics, the first set of rules to help scientists understand the atom.
It was a cookbook. Given any experiment, you look at the cookbook of Bohr and Heisenberg, you look at the recipe, and it told you how many quantum tomatoes, how many quantum celeries, how long do you have to cook the quantum stew, and you would know precisely what the outcome was going to be.
Today, the names of Heisenberg and Bohr are still known to every student of physics. Their work opened a new era in which the atom could not be ignored. Werner Heisenberg and Niels Bohr were on a high. Their close relationship had transformed physics. They became inseparable. They walked the coast of Denmark, they hiked through the Alps, and they skied together. All the time, their conversations delved further and further into the atom. Together, they'd made a quantum leap for science in understanding the jumping particles. But the scale of Bohr and Heisenberg's achievement was about to end the golden years they'd spent together in Copenhagen. The young Heisenberg's success with Niels Bohr in Copenhagen had made him hot property. In the autumn of 1927, Heisenberg's brilliance landed him a professorship back in Germany at Leipzig University. At the age of 26, he became his country's youngest professor. But despite their physical separation, their relationship remained central to both men, and it seems they deeply missed each other's company. In December 1928, Niels Bohr summed up his feelings about Heisenberg in a letter. In an era noted for its formality, especially between scientists, his words declared an unassailable affection and respect.
Rarely have I felt myself in more sincere harmony